All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our April 2024 Small Ruminant webinar. I'm your host, Carolyn Edie, the Small Ruminant Outreach Specialist for UW-Madison Division of Extension. Are you guys getting feedback?
Yeah, I can hear some feedback.
I wonder where that's coming from. Sorry, one moment.
Probably need to mute all the participants.
Yep, they were supposed to do. Yep. Okay. With us tonight is Dr. Andrew Weaver, Assistant Professor and Extension Specialist with North Carolina State University. While we wait for everyone to join, we'll put up a couple of polls for you. So please take a moment to answer our brief participant poll. Understanding the demographics of our participants helps us to improve extension programs and services. Asking for the following information also helps us meet our instructional requirements for compliance with federal non-discrimination policies. Providing us with this information is voluntary. You are not required to fill out this form to participate in extension programs. And if you have any questions about this form or why Extension collects this information, please contact Kim Waldman, Compliance Coordinator and Equity Strategist, UW-Madison Division of Extension, 608-263-2776, or kim.waldman@wisc.edu. And we'll wait a couple, maybe 30 more seconds or so before we will continue on to our different polls. All right, thank you for everyone who has participated in that poll. And we also have one more producer poll, which lets our guest speaker know who is in the room with us, like what kind of animals you have, how long you've been a producer, and where you are located. And I hope you can't hear a lot of background noise. My office is right next to Subway. And so we have a lot of maybe noise coming through the wall. And the really hard thing is all the smells coming through. So it really makes me hungry when I sit here in the evening on my webinars. So we'll get through it and I'll have a snack maybe later. All right, if we can have a couple more people answer the questions, we'll be good. We look like we have several from Wisconsin and some from outside of Wisconsin and Iowa. Some new producers, experienced producers. Meat sheep, meat goats, dairy sheep, fiber goats. And a big range of experience. So it's great to see everyone here with us. And tonight, I'm just gonna give 10 more seconds and then we'll end the poll. And I probably counted to 10 really fast. So tonight, like I said, we have Dr. Andrew Weaver, Extension Specialist and Professor at North Carolina State University. And tonight he's going to be presenting about feeding your flock's genetic potential with proper nutrition management. And that goes really well with our last month webinar with Rusty Burgett and talking about how we can get those genetics to their full potential. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to you, Dr. Weaver. Thank you for joining us. And we will also be asking you to put questions in the chat, and we will answer questions at the end.
Well, thanks for having me. I'll get my screen shared here. Let's see. How does that look?
Looks great. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, yeah, thanks for the introduction. And I probably have too many slides for our hour time slot here. So I won't spend too much time getting started here. But I saw the schedule and I saw Rusty was speaking before me on genetics, and I thought it might be a good opportunity to kind of build off of what he discussed and share some of my thoughts on nutrition. Because I think, nutrition and genetics go hand in hand. And this quote is one of my favorites and really illustrates that. It's from Jay Lush's book, Animal Breeding Plans. It's been around a while, but I think it's something we need to keep in the forefront of our minds as we think about our management systems. And so this idea that the genes cannot develop the characteristic unless they have the proper environment, and no amount of attention to the environment will cause the characteristic to develop unless the necessary genes are present. So really what this means is we need good genetics, and we need a good environment to go along with that. We can have the best genetics in the world. We can do everything Rusty talked about a few weeks ago, and we can have the best genetics, but if we don't provide those genetics with the environment, with the nutritional resources they need to express themselves, we really will have animals that don't perform up to that genetic potential. We'll be lacking that full genetic potential, and we probably won't be achieving our goals. On the other side, we could have the best management system in the world. We could do everything right in terms of the proper nutrition program and other management concepts. And yet, if we don't have the genetics there, there's going to be kind of a maximum threshold of performance. Our animals are only going to do so well because the genes just aren't there to do any better. So if we have good genetics and we can feed those genetics and provide those genetics with the environment they need to reach their full potential, that is when our animals are going to really perform to their best. And we're going to realize that potential in our operation. And so speaking on the nutrition side of things, some things I encourage folks to think about as they start talking about and thinking about their nutrition program is, what feeds or forages do you have available? Again, we can come up with a great ration, but if you don't have access to the ingredients in that ration, if you don't have access to the forages that would be included in that grazing plan per se, it's not going to do a whole lot of good for you. And so we need to realize, what do we actually have available to us and readily available? What's the nutrient quality of those feeds or forages that you have available? And then what are the animal requirements? And so if we know what we have available and what's realistic for us to get our hands on, and then what our animals need, now we can start to work with that and compare the two and think about, okay, what do we need to supply those animals to meet their demands? And so we take all that together and then ask the question, is it practical? Can I do it? Again, if you have to drive 2 hours to get a feed ingredient to include in that ration, sure, it might work 1 week, but if you have to do that every week, it's probably not going to be sustainable. And so is that ration, is that feeding program something that's realistic and is going to work for you? And another example would be, if you decide, okay, I can mix my own ration, I can put all these ingredients together, come up with the perfect ration, that's great. But if you don't have any way to mix those ingredients and mix them well and appropriately, we're probably not going to provide them in a homogeneous, uniform way that is going to meet our animals' needs and requirements. And so maybe in that case, maybe it might make more sense to feed a pelleted feed that's all put together already for you. You don't have to mix, can all be fed as one. So there's a lot of options out there, and there's many right ways to do it. We just need to consider our own operations and what makes the most sense for our operations. And when we think about nutrition, and this is how I kind of conceptualize it and how it makes the most sense to me, I think about it in terms of supply and demand. So what's being supplied to our animals, what's available to our animals in terms of nutrients, what is going to be provided and available for them to consume, and how does that compare to what they demand? So what are their nutrient requirements? What is the demand? If we compare supply and demand, if supply is greater than demand, that's great. That means they're going to meet they should meet those nutrient requirements, maybe exceed the nutrient requirements. They might even gain more than expected, or maybe they get a little bit over conditioned. But on the flip side, if supply does not meet demand, then those animals are going to be malnourished, undernourished, and not be able to reach their true potential. So comparing supply and demand, we can make sure we're feeding the correct amount of the right thing, make sure we're not overfeeding and wasting that feed. At the same time, we can make sure that we're not underfeeding and coming up short and not reaching the potential that our animals have. So before we get any further, I just wanted to go over a few vocabulary terms that I might throw out there through the course of the presentation. Just make sure everyone is on the same page with what these acronyms stand for. So DMI is dry matter intake. That's the amount of dry matter they consume every day. So that's what they consume minus the water. So we can think about things on an as-fed basis. That would be the dry matter plus the water. When we compare feeds, we compare them on a dry matter basis. We take the water out so that we can compare all of those feedstuffs on an equal playing field. We also think about what that animal consumes on a dry matter basis. So again, we can compare the requirements on a level playing field. The TDN would be the total digestible nutrients. That's a measure of energy. So in ruminant nutrition, because we have those microbes that are going to be doing a lot of work for us in the rumen, we can think about kind of in a really broad sense the energy available in a feedstuff as represented by that TDN value. Crude protein, obviously a measure of protein. And then NDF is neutral detergent fiber. That's a measure of essentially plant cell wall components. We're going to come back to this here in just a little bit. It's going to help us predict dry matter intake and give us an idea of how much dry matter they're actually going to consume on a given day. That's going to vary based on the NDF content in those forages that we are going to be feeding. Before I get any further, though, we do need to recognize that water is the most important nutrient. And we need to make sure we have a clean, easily accessible source of water at all times. There's lots of ways to provide water to our animals, whether they're housed in a barn or out on pasture, whether it's a kind of a set stock continuous graze system or whether it's a rotational graze system. There are lots of options out there for permanent and temporary water systems. They vary in price. And it's really up to you and your operation and what makes the most sense for you. But I encourage you to make sure you have a clean, palatable water source at all times available for those animals. And one thing we'll just note, a lot of the feed troughs that we go and buy at the local feed store, a lot of those feed troughs are black in color. Well, when you take a black feed trough or a black water trough and you put out in the middle of your pasture in the middle of the summer, what happens? It gets really hot. It's going to be less palatable for those animals. And so simple things like that are things that we often overlook. You can see in the pictures here, whether you use, I found some green water troughs that work really well. You can use some blue ones. Even the silver ones generally are okay. Find something or put that water near a shade source where it's not going to get as hot. Things like that are going to encourage greater water intake and make sure those animals stay hydrated. That's kind of the foundation and basis of nutrition and making sure those animals remain healthy and productive. So moving on from there, we talk about the demand for other nutrients. Those nutrient requirements are going to vary based on the sex of the animal, the age, the weight. Obviously, larger animals, it takes more to just sustain their body weight to keep those tissues functioning every day. Stage of production, whether they're in lactation, late gestation, maintenance, that's going to influence what those nutrient requirements are. And then that environmental component, which is maybe a little bit harder to quantify, the environmental temperature, the heat index, any type of, climatic factors that are going to play into, how that animal feels, how it reacts, what it needs to sustain itself. If once we get outside of that thermoneutral zone, those nutrient requirements are going to start to vary. And so that's something we need to take into account and is within the context of our specific situation at a given time of year, but something we certainly can't forget about. The other thing to remember is we feed quantities of nutrients and not percentages. And so this is, I guess, maybe a pet peeve of mine. When you go to the feed store, you talk to the local feed rep, they will tell you, well, we've got a 12% feed and we've got a 14 and a 16 and 18% feed. That's generally referring to the protein content, the crude protein content in that feed. And certainly that's important to know. But at the end of the day, our animals don't eat percentages. They eat quantities. They eat pounds or ounces of a given nutrient. And so actually you can provide the same amount of protein to an animal feeding a 12% ration as you can feeding an 18% ration. If I simply feed more of the 12% ration and less of the 18% ration, the total pounds of protein consumed by that animal can be exactly the same. And so that is what meeting that quantity requirement is what's really important to meeting those nutrient requirements and something we need to consider. And I encourage you to look at the cost of the feed per unit of nutrient and look at, okay, which is the cheapest source of protein, if that is the limiting nutrient, if that's what we're focused on. And then whatever the cheapest source of protein is, that's the one I encourage you to purchase. And if it's the 12%, maybe we just need to feed a little bit more of it. If it's the 18%, maybe we don't need to feed as much of it. Sometimes one's going to be a cheaper source of protein than another. And so encourage you to think about nutrition in that way and don't just buy off percentages that you see on a feed tag. Rather think about what's the total quantity that I need to feed to meet the protein requirement or the energy requirement or the mineral requirement. That's going to allow you to much better optimize the rations that you're providing. As we think about stages of production and how nutrient requirements and body condition change throughout a production year, this graph illustrates that, and I just have referring to goat terms here to be the same trends in sheep. At the time of kidding, we expect our animals to be at the greatest body weight and body condition in that production cycle. We expect them to be on a 5-point scale, somewhere between 3.5 and 4 on body condition score. We certainly don't want them excessively fat. That can lead to dystocia issues, lambing, kidding issues. But at the same time, we need them to have a little bit of excess condition so that they have those nutrient reserves available to provide for their offspring through milk production during lactation. And so once lambing or kidding takes place, we have that obvious immediate loss in fetal weight, and then lactation will begin. And we do expect a good ewe or a good doe should lose body condition through lactation. Our goal with our nutrition program should be managing that weight loss, so that it does not get excessive. At the time of weaning, we expect our animals to be in the lowest body condition, around a 2 to 2.5. We do not want them to be below a 2. And so during this lactation time period, when nutrient requirements are very high, we need to provide and meet those nutrient requirements. At the same time, be monitoring body condition scores. If we have animals that seem to be losing more condition than what we think they should be, maybe we need to bump up how much we're feeding. If we have animals that are maintaining body condition score, I guess you could have animals that might be gaining body condition score too. That would be an indicator that maybe we're overfeeding. We can back off how much we're providing. We expect those good milking females to convert some of their nutrient reserves to milk production and raise a big set of lambs or kids for us. And so they will lose some weight there during lactation, and certainly don't make culling decisions based on body condition at the time of weaning, because sometimes those ewes that are a little bit thinner are actually the ewes that weaned the most pounds of lamb or kids. And so encourage you to look at litter weights and then compare that back to how those ewes performed. And so once weaning occurs, those animals, they enter that maintenance state where they're open, they're dry, their nutrient requirements are very low, and they have a long time to build back body condition. At the time of breeding, we want them to be in a body condition score of a 2.5 to a 3, so slightly below average. And the reason for that is we want them to be gaining body weight through breeding. And by having them in that state and that increased plane of nutrition, they're more likely to ovulate more eggs, and we'll generally increase our lambing percentage by doing that. If they're already fat, they're not going to respond to that flushing effect very well. So 2.5 to 3 as we go through the breeding season, and then we have through early mid-gestation as we enter late gestation, getting back up into that 3 range on body condition score as we approach the lambing or kidding event once again. As we compare those different stages of production to actual nutrient requirements, Again, I mentioned that we need to focus on pounds of nutrient required, not percentages. And so here I have listed, I just kind of have summarized dry matter intake, TDN, so energy and protein requirements. This would be for 130-pound doe raising twins. And you can see that as we go from maintenance in the blue bars to late gestation in the orange bars, lactation in the gray bars, dry matter intake generally does increase. If we look at energy requirements, they're relatively low during maintenance. They increase substantially during late gestation and remain high during lactation. And protein follows the same trend, very low during maintenance and elevated. Really, protein requirements double during late gestation and lactation. Those are pounds of nutrient required. Now, this next graph is going to show those nutrient requirements on a percentage basis. And this is where it can get a little bit deceiving. So if we look at dry matter intake as a percentage of body weight, this is a percentage of body weight for dry matter intake. As a percentage of body weight, dry matter intake will increase just a little bit as we go through these different stages of production. If we look at energy, energy requirements on a concentration on a percentage basis are actually in goats are the same during maintenance and lactation. They are elevated during late gestation, and that's because we have this substantial energy need during late gestation for that rapid fetal development that's taking place. 2/3 of fetal development takes place during late gestation. We need a lot of energy for that. So we need elevated energy concentrations there during late gestation. During lactation, they're just going to eat more during lactation. So they don't have that fetal mass taking up space in their abdomen, and so they can eat a lot more. Sure, they require more energy during lactation, but they're going to eat a lot more during lactation. So on a concentration on a percentage basis, it's actually comparable to maintenance. And that's where it gets confusing. And that's why I like to focus on pounds of nutrient required and not percentages. On a protein basis, kind of a similar trend as well. Now, if we look at sheep, same overall trends in terms of nutrient requirements. Energy requirements are going to increase substantially as we enter late gestation and stay high for lactation for both energy and protein. We look on a percentage basis, the trend's a little bit different than goats. TDN requirements on a concentration basis remain high for sheep as we go through lactation, and they do increase for protein as well. So again, I encourage you to focus on the top two graphs here and looking at the pounds of nutrient required for each one of these stages of production. Now, I mentioned that flushing effect and this idea that we want those animals to be in an increased plane of nutrition, gaining body condition prior to and leading into and really through the first, at least heat cycle of that breeding season. And by doing that, we're going to increase the ovulation rate and hopefully the number of lambs or kids born. So the goal here is to increase supplemental feeding or increase the quality of pasture that we have those animals on 2 to 3 weeks prior to the turnout of males and continue it through at least the first heat cycle. So at least the first 3 weeks. This flushing effect is really driven by energy. And so feeding excess protein during this time period really won't do much. Our focus and our investment should really be on high energy feedstuffs like corn. Corn works really well. And so high energy, high TDN feedstuffs. We're going to supplement that if you're in a grazing based system. Maybe we reserve some higher quality pasture, plan ahead, turn those animals out on that higher quality pasture during this time period, and that can have a similar effect. Depending on the size of animals you have, somewhere between a half a pound and a pound per head per day of supplementation of that high energy feed stuff will usually be sufficient. Again, it's going to depend. If you've got smaller framed ewes or does, a half pound might be sufficient. If you've got larger animals, maybe closer to a pound would be better for them. You're just going to have to gauge that based on the animals you have. And remember, they respond best when they're in that body condition score of 2.5 to 3 going into this flushing period. When we talk about the nutrition for growing lambs and kids, energy more often than not is the limiting nutrient. So I know, again, most of our feeds are labeled based on protein concentration. Actually, the vast majority of our commercial feedstuffs don't even have an energy content listed on the feed tag, another pet peeve of mine. Energy is generally the limiting nutrient. Energy is what we need to provide for these animals so that they can continue to grow. Our rumen microbes can oftentimes supply sufficient protein. And so we really need to focus on energy, yet a lot of our feeds don't even tell us how much energy is in there. And so we need to address that and feed stuff that we know are relatively high in energy during that growing phase of life. So what are high energy feeds? Generally, there are grains. We do need to be careful though, and some considerations. If don't just go and pour whole shell corn to a bunch of growing lambs or kids, especially if they're males. You're going to end up with a bunch of calculi issues. And so we need to be conscientious of calcium phosphorus ratios. We're going to talk about that more here in just a second. We need to be aware of what is the cost per pound of energy in that feed stuff. So what's the cost per pound of nutrients? And making sure that we can provide those animals with the cheapest form of energy available that's also, palatable and from a health standpoint, sufficient and adequate for their stage of life. I also encourage you to keep an eye on and try to calculate a cost to gain. So how much are you investing in feed for every pound those animals gain? And knowing what that cost of gain number is going to be a very valuable tool for you to determine, how long should you feed these animals for? Is the margin relative to, cost of gain relative to market price, is that adequate? And, is it in a positive state where you're actually going to be making money on that gain? Or is it a state where, we're actually losing money for every pound those animals gain? And in which case we certainly need to either change up our feedstuffs or get those animals sold as quickly as possible. So look at that cost of gain, compare that to market price. Cost of gain should be less than market price. If market price is less than cost of gain, if it's costing you more to put a pound on that animal than what the market is returning to you, you've got a problem, and you need to figure out either a new ration, a new plan of action, or get those animals sold, because every pound they gain, you are losing money. So hopefully that cost of gain is less than the market price. And in which case, if cost of gain is less than market price for every pound they gain, we're actually making money. And that's the case. That's the scenario that we want to be in. Keep in mind that cost of gain generally increases as those animals get heavier. The heavier they get, the more of the nutrients that we provide go to their maintenance requirements, and the higher the cost of gain is. So as animals get bigger and closer to that finished weight, the higher the cost of gain is. At the same time, as animals get heavier, we know that market price declines. That's that slide. And so market price is decreasing, cost of gain is increasing. We just need to be aware of where do those two lines cross and make sure we market those animals before we get past that point. So again, these graphs are laid out, formatted very similar to the ones with regarding the mature females. So for growing kids, this would be kids that we expect to gain 1/3 of a pound per day, going from 30 pounds in the blue bars, 45 pounds in the orange, 65 pounds in the gray bars, and 80 pounds in the yellow bars. So as we increase body weight from 30 pounds up to 80 pounds at the same rate of gain, we expect dry matter intake to increase. From a quantity of nutrient standpoint, we expect energy requirements to increase and protein requirements to increase. So as those animals get heavier, they require more energy and more protein to maintain the same level of performance, the same level of average daily gain. Why do they require more energy to continue to grow at the same rate? That's because they are larger animals, and more of those nutrients are partitioned to maintenance and to just keeping more body tissue functioning every day. And so we need more and more energy in their diet, more and more protein in their diet, just to satisfy their maintenance requirements. So to keep them growing at the same rate, as they get heavier and heavier, we actually need to provide them with more and more energy and more protein to make sure those needs are met. Now, where the trends kind of reverse and where it can get confusing is when we look at this on a percentage basis. On a percentage of body weight basis, dry matter intake actually decreases as those animals get heavier. But on a quantity basis, dry matter intake actually increases. TDN requirements, so energy requirements on a concentration basis, decrease as the animal gets heavier. But on a quantity basis, energy requirements actually increase. That animal requires more energy, but because they're eating more, the percentage that they need to consume is actually lower. And the same trend is true for protein. If we look at lambs, these are lambs that are a little bit heavier, growing at a greater rate, 2/3 of a pound per day, going from 88 pounds up to 130 pounds. Similar trends here. Dry matter intake is going to increase, energy requirements increase. With these lambs that are already, close to 90 pounds, protein requirements actually stay the same as we go through that kind of finishing phase of life. So really, we should, again, be focused on energy during this phase, and protein can remain relatively constant. If we think about this on a percentage basis, In sheep, on a concentration basis, it actually stays about the same as we get to go through these heavier weights. And so it's a little bit more straightforward with sheep. Slight variations here between sheep and goats. But the overall trends are relatively similar. Just keep in mind, as animals get heavier, if we want them to keep growing at the same rate, we got to feed them more. So calcium and phosphorus, this is something that we certainly need to be conscientious of. It can lead to big problems if these two minerals get out of line in our ration. So high concentrate rations. So we just talked about growing animals need high energy feeds. Well, those high energy feeds are probably going to contain lots of concentrates. Those concentrates are inherently high in phosphorus and low in calcium, which is going to result in a very low calcium to phosphorus ratio. Most of our forages are adequate for calcium. Most of our grains are very high in phosphorus and very low in calcium. So if we're feeding a lot of grain with minimal forage, minimal roughage, it's very likely that our calcium phosphorus ratio is going to be very low and out of line from what it should be. When we get these two out of line, we increase the chance of development for urinary calculi, and this is going to be more prevalent in our male animals. And so to prevent that calculi, we want the calcium phosphorus ratio to be greater than or equal to 2 to 1. And so we need to make sure we have at least 2 parts calcium for every 1 part phosphorus. If we're buying a complete feed from the feed store, still check the feed tag and make sure that it has at least 2 parts calcium for every 1 part phosphorus. But most of our complete feeds, I hope, are adequate and appropriate for calcium phosphorus ratio. Hopefully, whoever formulated that considered calcium phosphorus ratio, but still double check. If we're mixing our own feeds, whether it be limestone or we can calcium carbonate, mix that in to add that extra calcium into the diet and make sure that we have 2 parts calcium for every 1 part phosphorus. It can be as high as 7 to 1, but we need to make sure that it's at least 2 to 1. And then mineral nutrition. So I'll just give a shout out. I just got off before this webinar started. I was on the Eastern Alliance for Production of Catons, hosted a webinar this evening with Dr. Van Son from Penn State Extension. He is an expert on mineral nutrition. He did a fantastic job talking about mineral nutrition and requirements and making sure that we are feeding and making sure our animals are getting the appropriate quantity of minerals. Did an excellent job. I by no means can speak to minerals on the same level that he can, but that webinar was recorded and should be available. And so if you're interested, you can reach out to me or anyone else on the leadership team here, and we can try to figure out how to get you a link to that recording, because I highly encourage you to go back and listen to that. He did an excellent job talking about mineral nutrition. I will just mention, kind of in a really broad sense, make sure that we provide our animals with a free choice loose mineral that is species specific. So if you have sheep, get a sheep mineral. If you have goats, get a goat mineral. They are going to vary. We need to also make sure that our animals are provided with vitamins A, D, and E, especially if they're in confinement. Those are the essential vitamins. Those are the ones that our sheep and goats body, they can't synthesize naturally. They need to be provided in the diet. Our B vitamins, vitamin K, are synthesized by rumen microbes. So if we have a healthy rumen, vitamin B, our B vitamins and vitamin K should be fine. A, D, and E are what we need to make sure get in the diet. And if we're out grazing, we're probably sufficient. If we have animals in a barn in a dry lot, confined, we need to make sure that either our feed contains vitamin A, D, and E, or our mineral mix contains an A, D, and E supplement. And so what happens when we get deficient? Where do these minerals come from? What happens when we get deficient? Vitamin A comes from beta carotene in our green fresh forages. So again, if they're out grazing, they're probably going to be sufficient for vitamin A. If they get deficient in vitamin A, we tend to see slower growth, retained placenta issues, weak lambs. So if you're observing those symptoms, those signs, maybe you have a vitamin A issue, especially if you have animals, again, in a barn, feeding them dry hay over the winter. Vitamin A supplementation is something that we need to be aware of. Vitamin E, again, green fresh forages. If we're feeding harvested forages, we're going to need to supplement vitamin E. What's the deficiency here? White muscle disease. So vitamin E and selenium work together. And so we need to provide both to minimize the occurrence of white muscle disease. And then our vitamin D, sun-cured hays are an excellent source of vitamin D. And stability is generally poor when mixed with minerals. So don't just mix up some vitamin D with your mineral and then leave it for 6 months and then feed it and think that that's probably sufficient. I would mix it in kind of as needed on a relatively short-term basis. And a deficiency here in vitamin D is going to lead to rickets in our young animals, osteomalacia, more bone issues in older animals. And so again, that's just kind of a really, really brief surface level overview of vitamin and mineral nutrition. Certainly there's more detail. I just don't have time to cover all of it tonight. And so that is demand. That's kind of quantifying demand, what they need during different stages of production, different stages of life, different weights and things like that. So we need to consider that demand side of the equation. And then from this point on, we're going to focus on supply. And so supply really starts with a forage or feed analysis. We're looking at the feed tag, although that feed tag isn't, necessarily the most descriptive thing in the world. And so having that feed analysis, that forage analysis is really a great investment, a big bang for your buck in terms of being able to optimize the rations for your animals. It's going to tell you what are they getting from the pasture that they're grazing or the hay that you're feeding, and then make sure that when we do provide some supplemental feed, we're not undersupplying or oversupplying that feed. And so I really encourage you to get a forage analysis, a hay analysis done. You can work with your local livestock extensions agent to get that done. Every state's a little bit different in the services they provide. We have a state lab that we can get these tests run for about $10 a sample, which you really can't beat that. Even if you have to go to one of the commercial labs, it might be $30 or $40 a sample, which is still the feed savings by having that analysis and being able to optimize those rations. It is well worth it. And so I encourage you to reach out to your local extension office and ask them. They can even help you get the hay sample in many cases and get that sent off. Really encourage you to get that done, because really that's going to tell us, okay, what is being supplied? And then we can work from there to decide, are requirements being met and how much supplement do I need to provide? And so once we have that analysis, there's some things that we can determine from it. And one of the things what we can do is estimate what the dry matter intake is going to be. Again, this is kind of a crude measurement. It's not perfect. It may be a little bit higher than this. It may be little bit lower than this, but it's going to give you kind of a crude, rough idea of what that dry matter intake might look like. And so we can use the NDF value that's provided on our analysis. So just a reminder, NDF is that neutral detergent fiber. So it's a measure of hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin in that forage. That's really a measure of plant cell wall components. As that plant becomes more mature, as that plant gets taller, as that plant produces a seed head, the NDF content is going to increase because the plant needs more structural component to hold itself up as it gets taller. And so as those plants get more mature, NDF increases. As NDF increases, intake decreases. So here the equation, dry matter intake is equivalent to 120 divided by the percent NDF. And this is the only case in math when you don't convert the percent to a decimal. And so just an example what this looks like. Let's just use some fresh ryegrass. Let's say it's 38.7% NDF. We plug this into our equation. And again, like I said, do not convert the percentage to a decimal. Just do 120 divided by 38.7. You get 3.1% of body weight on dry matter intake. So that gives us a starting point. Then if we know what our animals weigh, we can calculate, we can estimate what the dry matter intake is going to look like. So for 130-pound doe, that'd be somewhere around 4 pounds of dry matter per day. For 150-pound ewe, that'd be about 4.5, just a little over 4.5 pounds per day. Generally, dry matter intake is going to be somewhere between 1.5% and 3% of their body weight. If we have dry use and maintenance, it's going to maybe really mature forage. It's going to be towards the lower end of this range. If we have some lactating ewes, raising a bunch of twins or triplets, if we have some very immature forage, very palatable, easy to digest forage, it's going to be towards the higher end of this range. So let's just walk through a quick case study here. So we got a hay analysis done. We have this grass hay. It's going to 88% dry matter, 63% NDF, 54% TDN, and 11% crude protein. So we've just pulled these values off of our hay analysis. We know that based on these values, based on that NDF number, we know that our 150-pound ewe is going to consume about 2.84 pounds of dry matter per day. Again, we just used the equation we just talked about, plugged in that 63.4% NDF number, and got 2.84 pounds per day. And so if we know how much they eat in dry matter per day, and we know that TDN and crude protein, that percent TDN, that percent crude protein, that's given to us on a dry matter basis. So that tells us that 54% of the dry matter is energy, is TDN. And so we know how much dry matter they're going to eat. So then we can calculate how many pounds of TDN they're going to eat. So if we think about, again, this is the supply side of the equation. So dry matter intake, we said that's 2.84 pounds a day. TDN then would be about 1.5 pounds a day. We just take 2.84 pounds of dry matter. We know that dry matter is 54.1% TDN. So times 0.541 is going to give us about 1.5 pounds of energy. Similar math for the crude protein. They're going to consume about 1/3 of a pound of protein. So that's how much is supplied to them in energy and protein every day. We can then go into our nutrient requirement tables, and we can look up, for our 150-pound ewe at maintenance, what does she demand? Well, that 150-pound ewe, our nutrient requirement tables are going to tell us that she's going to eat somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2.6 pounds a day, that she needs to consume 1.37 pounds of TDN and about 0.2 of a pound of protein. So now we can just compare supply to demand. Is supply greater than demand? And that's going to tell us, are the requirements met? And so in this case, the TDN and the protein numbers relative to supply are greater than what is demanded by that animal. And so this hay would be sufficient to feed to this ewe in maintenance, and she would maintain body condition, and it would be adequate for her in that stage of production. Now, let's just say we're going to feed the same hay, and we're going to take that same ewe, and now she's gotten pregnant, and we're in, that last 30 to 45 days of gestation, where we've entered late gestation with twins. Intake stays, relatively the same. We have, that large fetal mass taking up a lot of space in the abdomen. Her intake may even be a little bit compromised from that. But yet we have rapid fetal development taking place, lots of energy and protein required. So now she requires 2.67 pounds of energy per day and about 0.42 pounds of protein per day. So now if we compare supply and demand, supply does not meet demand. Demand is greater than supply. Now we've got a problem that we need to address. So how do we address this? Well, in this case, we probably need to increase supplemental feeding. We need to provide an energy and protein source to these animals to make up that difference and make sure that they are meeting their energy and protein requirements. And this is paramount during late gestation. If we short a ewe or a doe during late gestation, we have a very high chance of the development of pregnancy toxemia. Pregnancy toxemia has a very low recovery rate and not something we want to get involved with if we don't have to. And so prevention is key. And one of the great ways we can prevent that is making sure they have adequate nutrition during late gestation. And so we take that same ewe, she lambs, we enter lactation. Again, nutrient requirements remain high. That hay is not going to be sufficient to meet requirements during lactation alone. So again, we need to provide some supplemental feeding. So this is what I like to call maybe tailgate math. It's math that once you do it a few times, it gets pretty simple. You can do it on the tailgate of your truck in the barn and scratch out these numbers and kind of get a rough idea. Am I close to requirements? Am I below? Am I above? Where am I at? If you want to get a little bit more precise though, there's ration balancing software available. One of the great tools that's out there is provided by Iowa State. Their brand software, they've got it for goats, they've got it for sheep. That's going to allow you to mix multiple different feedstuffs. It's going to calculate those values for you and tell you whether you're meeting those requirements or not. It's going to do a much better job than maybe we can just on the tailgate of our truck and doing that kind of crude math. But again, it's a little bit of an investment. It's a little bit more time learning that program, but I certainly encourage you if this is something you're interested in and your extension office, again, might be able to help you kind of work through and think through these ration balancing software programs. But if you just want to kind of get a crude estimation, are you close? Are you not? Then some of that math that we just talked about will at least kind of get you in the ballpark. And so from this point forward, I do want to talk about grazing. And so, nutrition, grazing, again, they go hand in hand. I think grazing is a fantastic way that we can, if we do a better job with our grazing management, it is a fantastic way to decrease our input costs. We know that feed is generally our greatest variable cost in our operations. Well, if we do a good job managing our pastures and our grazing systems, we can decrease how much we're supplementing those animals. Those animals can actually be provided with a higher quality nutrition from that high, from forages in the right stage of maturity. And so we can really get we can get multiple bang for our buck here in terms of providing a higher quality nutrition source at a cheaper price. And so we know that most of the variability and profitability in our operations is related to input costs. Those operations that are most profitable are generally those that have the lowest input costs. It's not those that have the highest outputs. It's not those that are most productive. It's those that actually have the lowest input costs. And so I think it's something we often overlook in our operations, and better forage management is one of those areas that we can address to help decrease those input costs and improve the profitability of our operations. So as we talk about grazing, we really need to think about it from maybe a more holistic approach. And it really starts with our soils, because we know that if we have healthy soils, biologically active soils, we are going to have healthier, stronger, more nutritious forages and plants for our animals to consume. And when those animals consume those forages, they are going to be provided with a greater plane of nutrition. They are going to be healthier. They are going to perform better, and really the best of both worlds. So if we can really start thinking about nutrition in our soils and then work from there up, we are going to ensure that we provide our animals with the highest quality nutrition that we can, while doing it in a relatively cost-effective way through our grazing program. And so as we start thinking about this, the principles of soil health, this is an idea we could spend a whole hour-long webinar just talking about the principles of soil health. And there's lots of webinars out there and podcasts out there that talk about these principles. But I just want to run through them real quick, and some of the acronym or the letters that I use to remember all of these. And so if we think about it, we apply these principles of soil health to our management systems. Again, it's going to allow us to start either below the ground in our soils and work up from there to make sure that we are meeting the needs of our animals in the best way possible. And so the first C here would be context. And the first principle is really understanding the context of our operations. The context for those of you that live in Wisconsin or Iowa is going to be very different than the context for me living in North Carolina. We're going to have different forages. We're going to have varying lengths in our grazing season. We're going to do things differently, and that's okay. We just need to understand what that context is and kind of the limitations, the boundaries of what we can and can't do, and be able to work within those boundaries. The second C is cover. So keep the ground cover. So we want to make sure that we have as little exposed bare soil as possible. By keeping that ground cover, we actually keep that soil cooler. We moderate the temperature of that soil. We keep the microbes more active. We maintain and we kind of trap and hold in more water. We're actually more drought resistant if we can keep that surface covered. And so keeping ground cover, whether it's with a living plant or even a dead plant, is better than no ground cover at all. So then we have two C's. Now we start into the L's. So the first one here would be livestock and integrating livestock into a system. And this is one that, this one should be pretty easy for all of us to do, right? I assume that most of us on here are livestock producers. And so we already have livestock in our system. These principles of soil health were designed for all farmers, maybe those crop producers as well as livestock producers. So maybe those crop producers maybe need to consider and do a better job of integrating livestock into their system. I'm sure this is something that we are all doing, and that's why we're on the webinar this evening. So the second L would be a living root. Keeping a living root in the ground, in the soil at all times is best. And so minimizing any time that we don't have a living root, is something we need to consider and think about. By having that living root in the soil, we are promoting biological activity within the soil. We're allowing that plant to capture sunlight and take those carbohydrates that it's generating, pass those on, and it actually plants leach carbon out of their roots. They are giving microbes carbon, and those microbes are then grabbing nutrients in the soil and bringing it back to the plant. So it's this great symbiotic relationship, but it takes that living root, that living plant, providing for the microbes so the microbes can provide back to the plant. And so a great perennial forage stand is a great way to do this. If we're using annuals, make sure that transition period between annuals is as short as possible. If you're in crop production, I encourage you to use some cover crops to keep a living root in the soil, even during the latter part of the fall and early spring months before you plant maybe your cash crop. And so now we start in the D's. The first one would be disturbance. So we want to avoid excessive disturbance. A little bit of disturbance at key strategic times is what we should focus on. If we constantly disturb that soil, like what occurs in a continuous graze set stock type management system, that's going to lead to compaction in our soils. It's going to lead to poor plant health. We actually could lead to plant death. We have dead plants. Now we don't promote microbial life either. We don't have plants for animals to consume. And so excessive overgrazing is something we certainly want to avoid. But disturbance at key time points can actually promote those plants to grow and regenerate and sequester more carbon and put that back in the soil. And so managing disturbance is something that we need to consider. And then the second D would be diversity and improving the diversity of living organisms. This would be in all facets. So improving the diversity of organisms in the soil, improving the diversity of our plants and our pasture systems. So I encourage you, don't just grow a monoculture. It's great. It's a beautiful pasture of just, maybe straight orchard grass, but maybe, get some clover in there. Maybe get some vetch, other types of forage species, incorporate those into your pastures. Maybe if you have sheep, maybe consider a different livestock species to integrate in with those sheep. The more diversity you can have in your system, that's going to bring different beneficial components to that grazing system. So we think about these principles of soil health. You can remember them: CC, LL, DD. They're going to improve the health of our soils and ultimately the health of our ecosystems, our forage production, the quality of those forages produced, and ultimately improve animal performance and animal health. So we think about plant biology and how our plants grow. They grow very similar to our animals, right? Growth is going to be relatively slow at first, early on in life, and then plants are going to grow really fast, and then they're going to plateau as they get mature. Now, we know that as those forages mature, the lignin content, the NDF, the structural, the cell wall components, those structural components that we talked about are going to increase. Because again, that plant is getting taller, it's growing taller. It's kind of like a skyscraper. It needs more cell wall components to hold it up. And so it needs more lignin. It's going to have higher NDF to keep that plant held up and taller as it matures. Well, as that plant matures, as NDF increases, we know that intake is going to decrease. We also know that the protein content, the energy content, and the palatability of those forages is going to decrease as that plant matures. So lignin content increases, nutrient content decreases as that plant matures. So if we have plants that are super mature, our animals are going to eat less of them. And not only are they going to eat less of them, but what they eat is going to be less nutrient dense. So we really want to target grazing in that phase 2 of development. If we graze those forages too early on, they're not going to have time to regrow and sustain themselves. We're actually going to damage the plant if we graze them too early. So we want to wait for them to start growing, but if we don't want to wait until they get all the way to maturity. We want to kind of optimize that balance between plant development, nutrient content, to make sure we're providing for the animal while at the same time managing the health of our forages. So we've done some work with some annual forages over the last couple years at our small ruminant education unit. Just wanted to share a little bit of that data, maybe give you some ideas on how you can quantify this and think about it relative to your grazing system and your animal nutrient requirements. And so crabgrass is a plant. It loves hot and humid conditions. Maybe for those of you in Wisconsin or Iowa, maybe it might not work quite as well for you, or the growing season for it might be a lot shorter. But for us, in July, August, it is as happy as can be. And so it can work really well as an alternative to our cool season base. of forages. And so crabgrass, we planted it in May. We start grazing usually in early July. And if you look here, I know it's in yellow, it's kind of hard to see. I should have changed the color there. But in terms of total digestible nutrients and energy content of that crabgrass, it's in the mid 70s in mid-July. So it has the same amount of energy in it as many of our concentrate, our grain type feeds. So it's a very high quality feed stuff, especially early on in the summer. That energy content does decrease as the summer goes on and that plant matures, as we just talked about. But even, by early September, it's still in the upper 60s on TDN. So still a decent energy source, especially for mature animals. So if we just think about this, how does this compare to the nutrient requirements of our animals? I just threw cattle in here as a reference. So for a lactating cow, more than sufficient for a lactating cow, even for a lactating ewe. In terms of energy, this crabgrass would have met the energy requirements for lactating ewe throughout the entire summer. For a 700-pound kind of background steer, it would have been sufficient early on in the summer. As summer went on, maybe a little bit on the low side. For a growing lambs have extremely high energy requirements. So we've discussed this already. So for a growing lamb, even though it's a relatively high forage for energy, it still is not sufficient for a growing lamb. So we would have still needed to supplement an energy source for a growing lamb if we had them out on these pastures. In terms of protein, protein was a little bit lower, fluctuated between 8 and 10%. Now, keep in mind, we applied no fertilization, no nitrogen, nothing. We broadcast this forage on to fields that have not received any application of a fertilizer since I started working at NC State. And so, sure, if we had put nitrogen out on this forage, that crude protein content may have been a little bit higher. But for a relatively low input system and for grazing mature ewes, again, it's not terrible. Could be better, not terrible. So for lactating cow, lactating cow needs about 10% crude protein, not quite sufficient. For a lactating ewe, she needs a lot of protein, so it wouldn't have been sufficient for her. For a 700-pound steer, and for a growing lamb, those requirements are higher. I should have thrown a ewe at maintenance on here. She'd still be kind of, similar to maybe like a lactating cow in that, 10 to 12% range. And so, maybe we would need some protein nutrition in this scenario. Although, if our rumen microbes are doing a good job, she might be able to get by, especially, as an open dry ewe. If I had used in any higher state of nutrition, a supplemental protein source may have been something that should be considered. And so just keep in mind our small ruminants, if you do have cattle, small ruminants do require a greater concentration of nutrients compared to cattle. After the crabgrass is an annual. So we come back in and plant ryegrass, which is a fairly common winter annual. It can be used as a cover crop. Similar story here. We took some forage samples throughout the growing period of that ryegrass last year. So they're early on in March. Extremely high quality, almost 80% TDN. So very high quality. And even by, the 1st of May, we're still at 70% TDN. So a great energy source, lots of carbohydrates in ryegrass. On a protein standpoint, really good. Again, this is with no nitrogen fertilization. We're over 15% crude protein in early March. And that still gets to about 10% by the 1st of May. Compare our nutrient requirements here and still for pretty much just about all classes of animals. For energy, that ryegrass is sufficient. For protein, especially early on in the spring, sufficient. As we get later on in the spring and that ryegrass gets more mature, maybe we could use some protein supplementation, but we're pretty close. And so there's a lot of opportunity here. And if we had not done the forage test, we may be supplementing far in excess of what needs to be supplemented. We actually, when we started doing these projects and I got these forage analysis back, we cut our supplemental feeding in half. Because, once we knew what our forages contained, we knew that those animals were getting a lot of their energy and protein from the grass and did not need a whole lot of supplementation. So I should go back and add up how much in cost savings we've had just by the investment in the $10 forage analysis. But it is substantial. The return on the investment there would be very high and is something that's been very beneficial to us and something that I encourage you to do to better optimize what you're feeding. So I think, working with the grass is a better way of going about things than maybe managing a system and just taking advantage of grass maybe when we have it. But maybe I encourage you to think about, when do you have grass and how can we pair those times of grass availability with high animal demands? And I think our cool season forage, our growth curve here pairs up with small ruminants maybe better than a lot of our other livestock species like cattle. And so we know that our cool season forages, this is for tall fescue, orchard grass would be relatively similar to this. Those forages, we're going to get some fall growth, right? We're going to get some rains in the fall. The temperatures are relatively moderate. We're going to get some high quality cool season forage growth in the early fall. Well, that can pair up really well with when we're breeding our small ruminants. We're going to breed them probably in the fall anyway, unless we're in an out of season breeding system. They're more fertile in the fall. Well, we can pair that up with the availability of high quality cool season forages during the fall months. And then we have pregnant ewes over the winter, and especially early mid-gestation pregnant ewes, their nutrient requirements are still relatively low. If we do run out of grass and have to feed some hay, not the end of the world. They can probably get by on some decent, average quality hay. And then as we get into late gestation, those nutrient requirements really start to increase. Hopefully we can pair that up with the growth and development, the early season growth of our cool season forages. I showed you, that ryegrass almost 80% TDN early on in the year. Well, if we can pair that time period up with late gestation ewes, we could really be able to provide a lot of the nutrition they need with forages and maybe minimize or decrease the amount of supplemental feeding that is required. And then when we have an abundance of high quality cool season forages available in April and May, pair that up with lactation. We have lots of forage. We have ewes that want to eat a lot, that need a lot of nutrition. Well, let's match those two time periods up. And then once weaning occurs there in early summer, we have open dry ewes for the rest of the summer. So if things get dry, if we have decreased availability of forages here in North Carolina, we get a pretty severe summer slump in our cool season forages. Those of you that live in more northern regions may not observe this summer slump or may not observe, maybe it's not quite as severe. For us, our cool season forages really shut down in the middle of the summer. Well, if we have open dry ewes, they can get by on minimal feed resources during those time periods. For us, that's where our annual forages have really come in and been beneficial. We can plant something like crabgrass, and we have a very nutritious, abundant feed source there in the middle part of the summer. We'll graze our fall lambing ewes, our pregnant fall lambing ewes on that crabgrass during the summer months. And it's a much better feed stuff than trying to graze some fescue that is really dormant and shut down during those hot summer months here in North Carolina. For you all, that might not be as big an issue, but we can kind of balance out this curve by using both cool season and warm season forages. And so working with those forages, we know that our forages need some rest and relaxation. We know they need some time to regrow, to regenerate their energy reserves after a grazing event. That grazing event is a form of disturbance. And so they need time to recover after that. Our forages are going to store, and they utilize carbohydrates to regrow that leaf after a grazing event. Those leaves are solar panels. So really, when we look out on our pasture, we are solar farmers. I know that solar farms are kind of a hot topic right now, but really us in the grazing livestock industry, we've been solar farmers long before putting solar panels up was a cool thing. And so those solar panels, our grass, our pastures are really just a giant solar panel. Those leaves are capturing sunlight, generating carbohydrates through photosynthesis, storing those carbohydrates in the root system and ultimately back in the soil. Then our animals are using those carbohydrates to grow. And so energy reserves are present in the meristem, which is kind of the base of the stem, the stolons and the roots of our plants. Well, when a grazing event occurs and that plant is, a part of that plant is consumed, the leaf is consumed, the solar panel all of a sudden goes away. The plant doesn't have a solar panel. So how does it get that solar panel back? Well, it's going to mobilize the energy reserves in these three locations and then use that carbohydrate to start to regrow that leaf. Once that leaf starts to regrow, our solar panel grows, and then photosynthesis can start occurring again, and that plant can regenerate those carbohydrates that have been pulled out of the reserves to regrow. Now, the problem is if we graze, we remove the leaf, and those carbohydrates are mobilized, the leaf starts to regrow, the leaf gets about an inch long, and then an animal comes back and grazes it again. Well, now we've just that plant has mobilized carbohydrates to regrow a leaf that was just taken away again. So now it has to mobilize even more carbohydrates to regrow the leaf the second time. And now if it's grazed again, eventually, as this process goes on, you can see eventually that plant's going to run out of carbohydrate reserves. What happens when it runs out of nutrient reserves? The plant dies. And so this is how overgrazing can lead to a lot of undesirable plants, can lead to a lot of weeds. It can lead to a really unsustainable grazing system and unhealthy animals, because those plants are going to die off. The favorable, the high quality, the nutritious plants that the animal prefers, that's palatable to the animal, those are the forages that are going to get overgrazed. Those are the forages that are going to get killed, because that animal comes back and constantly consumes them if that plant doesn't have enough time to rest. That plant needs time to rest, to regenerate that leaf. And then once that leaf is regenerated, it needs time to put carbohydrates back into its roots, back into those storage areas, so that when that grazing event occurs again after the rest period, it can now regrow that leaf again, and it has sufficient energy reserves to do so. We know that what we see above ground is mirrored by what we see below ground. So this just shows an example of, forages, if they're cut to 2 inches every week, we have a very short plant above ground, very minimal root mass below ground. If they're cut to 2 inches every 2 weeks, we have a little bit more root mass because there's a little bit more time to regrow, regenerate root mass. Cut to 2 inches every 4 weeks, so a 4-week rest period, a lot more root mass there because it's able to maintain and regenerate those carbohydrate reserves. This also illustrates that. We know that if 50% of that plant is grazed, the roots never stop growing. We can take half that plant away and the roots continue to be productive. If we take 70% of the plant away, though, now about 50% of the roots will stop growing for 17 days. So we lose half of our root functionality for 2.5 weeks by consuming 70% of the plant. If we go in and we graze 90% of that plant, we take away 90% of the plant mass that's there, 100% of the roots will stop functioning for 17 days. So we've shut down that plant for 2.5 weeks before the plant's even going to be able to really start regenerating itself. So by growing in, and this is where that philosophy of graze half, leave half comes into play. If we go in, we just graze half the plant that's there and then move on. We maintain a functional root mass. That root mass is going to be able to regenerate that leaf mass that much faster. We can come back, regraze that much sooner. We need to respect the minimum grazing heights of our plants. We know that for many of our cool season plants, it's generally 3 to 4 inches. If we graze closer than 3 or 4 inches, we're damaging that plant. That severe damage is going to take a long time for that plant to recover from. So we want to make sure we stop at 3 to 4 inches and graze no closer to the ground than that. Bermuda grass, a warm season perennial, we can get a lot closer, and that's because of the structure of the plant and how that plant grows. We can graze a lot closer. Crabgrass, we can get about 3 inches as well. We know that the more frequently we move pastures, actually the higher the utilization rate will be of our forages. So if our grazing period per paddock is only 1 to 2, maybe 3 days, we're going to be in that neighborhood of 55 to 60% utilization. If we only move animals between pastures once a month, every 30 days, our utilization rate will decrease to 35 to 40%. We have limited land mass available. We want to get everything we can from that land mass. Well, if we're not moving animals but once a month, we are really wasting 20% of the forage that's out there. If we can move animals more frequently, we get a higher utilization rate. We're able to utilize that resource that we have available. And so you put all this together, and that's why we encourage you to have a short, high intensity grazing period, but then remove those animals, put those animals in a different paddock and let that grass recover for a long period of time. That's going to encourage the most forage growth above ground and the most root development below ground, providing the highest yield and highest quality nutrition for our animals. Just an example of what that looks like, this is just some images from a couple years ago, one of our crabgrass fields. That's the image on the left. It was July 26th after a grazing event. We were co-grazing this with cattle and goats. I know there's a shadow there, so it's kind of hard to see, but that's exactly 1 month later. We took the animals away, let it rest for 1 month. We come back 1 month later, and you can see the abundance of forage that is regrown with just no nitrogen, no fertilizer, just a little bit of moisture. And you get a lot of regrowth that develops you have the nutrient deposits that have come naturally from the animals, and we have that forage growth that occurs once again, and we can regraze it again. We have a healthy plant. We've extended our grazing season, best of both worlds. And so we talk about this concept of ice cream, eating the ice cream versus the wrapper around the cone, especially animals that are in a state of high nutrient requirements. We want them eating as much ice cream as possible. And what I mean by ice cream is those palatable, high quality plant components of our pasture system. When you turn animals out in a paddock, the first thing they will go and eat is what I would consider the ice cream. They're going to eat those leaves that are less mature, those leaves that are higher in nutrient content, those plants that are higher in nutrient content. If we leave them there for a week, 2 weeks, a month, they're going to eat all the ice cream in the first few days. And once they eat all the ice cream, what are they left with? They're left with stems, weeds, undesirable plants. And that's what I would consider or use to the analogy, in terms of the wrapper around that cone. We love to eat ice cream. You or I we don't eat the wrapper around the cone. We probably only do so if we were starving. Well, if you leave those animals in a paddock for too long, they're going to be forced to eat the wrapper around the cone because there's nothing left to eat. And so when we force them to eat that wrapper around the cone, their intake is going to decrease. Those undesirable components are probably higher in NDF. They're going to eat less of them. Their intake is going to decrease. Their level of performance is going to decrease. So if we can keep those animals eating ice cream all the time, their intake is going to increase. Their level of performance is going to increase. Their health is going to increase. And so the graph here shows forage intake as a percentage of body weight relative to residual forage dry matter. So how much forage is left over after a grazing event? So the more forage that we leave behind after a grazing event, the higher the intake is. So we can actually get our animals to eat more by leaving more forage behind. It's kind of a confusing topic when you first think about it. But if we just go in, let those animals eat the ice cream, let them eat the best parts, and then move them on to the next paddock, they're going to eat as much as they possibly can because they love it. They're eating the ice cream. They're going to eat as much ice cream as possible. And then if we move them on to the next pasture, before we make them eat the wrapper around the cone, they're going to go to that next pasture and they're going to eat all the ice cream there. And so if we move animals frequently and we leave a lot of residual forage behind, we're allowing them to only eat ice cream. We're not forcing them to eat anything else. Their intake is going to be the greatest. So if we have growing lambs, growing kids, lactating ewes, lactating does, late gestation animals, if we have those animals that are in a high state of nutrient demands, move them frequently, get them onto new pasture, maximize intake. That's going to get the most nutrients into their bodies to achieve those or meet those nutrient demands. If you've got a bunch of open dry ewes, maybe in that scenario, you could force them to eat some wrapper around that cone, some of those less desirable components, and better utilize that pasture. There's two kind of concepts that we talk about: stocking rate and stock density. Stocking rate, simply the number or the weight of animals on a farm for an entire year or grazing season. As we think about stocking rate relative to animal output, there is an optimal zone. If we have too few animals, we're going to really underutilize our forage resources. We have the animals there, they're healthy, but it's not really economical because we're undergrazing. On the flip side, if we have way too many animals per acre per year, we are going to overgraze our pastures and animal output is really going to suffer. So really, we want to be somewhere in the middle. Stock density, on the other hand, is the number or the weight of animals, the number of animal units in a given area for a specific time. So time is the key difference here. And how do we control stock density? Really, it comes down to using temporary fencing. You may have a lot of permanent fence and may be able to control stock density with permanent fence, but really using temporary fencing allows you a lot of flexibility in controlling stock density. We know that as we increase stock density, we're going to improve vegetation utilization. We're going to have a more uniform residual, and we're going to improve nutrient distribution across our pastures. So as we start thinking about temporary fencing, one of our extension associates here at NC State kind of coined this term, branded this term called the power of one wire. And it's this idea that by using just, in some cases, just one strand of polywire, one strand of electric fence, we can control a lot about our grazing system. Now, kind of the disclaimer here is, goats do not They do not observe the power of one wire. Rather, goats probably need the power of poly net or even some permanent woven wire fence. If it doesn't hold water, it won't hold a goat. Sheep can be trained. Some sheep can be trained to one wire. Sheep can certainly be trained to 2 wires. And maybe want to use poly net, especially if we have some lambs or kids around. So the use of temporary fencing has many benefits. It allows us better control of our grazing system. We can allow them to graze a certain area, move on, let those pastures rest, and then regraze. We can manage forage utilization. We can improve overall pasture productivity, the longevity of our stand because our forages are going to be healthier, better nutrient distribution, ultimately parasite management too, and that's a whole nother topic. And it gives us an excuse to go out and see and observe our animals every day. And so when one is lagging behind and maybe less healthy, it allows us to find those animals quicker and get them the treatment that they need. There are some differences in grazing behavior between our sheep and goats. Sheep naturally want to graze. They want to reach down for forage on the ground. Goats naturally want to browse. They want to reach up. And so maybe pairing our animal species up with our grazing system and our environment, maybe we can do a better job with that. Cattle integrate really well with our small ruminants because our small ruminants generally prefer forbs, where our cattle prefer grass species. And so they actually are going to, if we have a very diverse pasture system, they're actually going to prefer different components in that pasture system. Just an example of how grazing behavior can be different between our species. This is some foxtail that actually showed up in our crabgrass fields. And so you can see here, really interesting, our sheep ate all of the leaves off the foxtail. So foxtail is generally considered an undesirable plant species. The sheep ate all the leaves off the foxtail. The cattle didn't even touch the foxtail plant. The cattle wanted nothing to do with it. The sheep, while they didn't eat the stem, they still ate the leaf. So the sheep got something out of that forage. The cattle got nothing out of it. So this is where that, one of the benefits of multi-species systems is, those sheep, those small ruminants may be able to utilize some of those plants that cattle consider undesirable. So there's some opportunity here, and certainly by increasing stock density, we can force animals to eat some things they may not want to eat with a high enough stock density, but we have to make sure we have the right class of animals to do that with. So there is some low-cost approaches to meeting nutrient demands, and that's our grazing management, doing a better job with grazing management. Remember, we want to target that forage at phase 2 of development. That's going to increase the intake of that forage. They're going to be eating more of a more nutrient-dense forage too, and so they're going to be better able to meet those nutrient demands, and we can avoid overgrazing. Rotate them frequently, allow that plant to rest and regrow, and we're going to have healthy plants and healthy animals. So in general, for most of our mature animals, they can be met with a forage, based ration with minimal to no supplementation, especially during maintenance. During late gestation lactation, if we're going to have to supplement at any time of the year, late gestation lactation is when we're going to have to do it. So that's where we need to, pay probably the closest attention. And certainly for our growing lambs and kids, they will need some supplementation. They very rarely will forage ever meet the energy requirements for growing lambs and kids. So just in summary, and I know I've gone a little long here, getting a forage test done is worth its weight in gold. It's a really good bang for your buck and a valuable investment. So I encourage you to do that. Determine what that forage supply is. How much forage do you have available? What's the quality of those forages, or what's the quality of the hay that you're feeding during the winter months? Then compare that to the nutrient demands of those animals and determine if you need some supplementation or not. Make sure vitamins and minerals are critically important. So make sure those requirements are met, and make sure they have a clean, palatable water source at all times as well. The Sheep Production Handbook is a great resource. So if you don't have that already, encourage you to get that. That has all the nutrient requirements are in there. And it's got a nutrient composition guide for different feedstuffs too. So it's a great resource, and encourage you to reference that book as well as you start thinking about nutrition. And so again, I apologize for going a little over here. And I know it's getting late, but I am happy to stick around and answer any questions that you all have.
Thank you, Dr. Weaver. That was a insightful, thorough synopsis of grazing and nutrition. So I really appreciate the time that you did take to preface on the nutrition requirements at the beginning, because sometimes that is hard to understand what all those codes and things mean. So if anybody has any questions, we didn't have any come in during the presentation, so we must have been intently listening and understanding, but you can add those to the chat right now. As you leave the Zoom, when you decide to leave, there will be a survey that will automatically pop up for you. So I also just want to thank everyone for coming and give them opportunity to put anything in the chat. Sandy or Todd, do you have anything you would like to add?
I'm good. I thought he did a wonderful job of covering things. Thanks, Andrew, a bunch.
You're welcome.
So one thing did come into the chat, any resources for finding out the nutritional value of weeds?
So that's a great question. A weed by definition is an undesirable species. So if an animal eats them, technically by definition, they're no longer a weed. They may be less desirable than other species, but if they eat them, they're technically not a weed by definition, but we may still think of them as weeds. And so I would encourage you, I would get those tested. You can test them in the same way that you can test your other pastures. So if you have some undesirable plant species out there, especially if your animals are eating them, maybe test those components, those parts of that plant that the animal is eating. When we do test pastures, I try to test parts of that pasture that the animal is going to eat. If there's a stick out there and the animals aren't going to eat that, don't include that in your forage sample that you're going to get tested, because the animals aren't going to eat it. So test the plant parts that the animal's going to eat. And on average, our animals are actually going to consume a higher concentration of nutrients than what our test is generally going to elucidate. So the animals are better at picking out higher quality components of that pasture than what we can go and clip in a forage sample. And so what that sample tells us, actually the animals are probably going to consume a little bit better than that, just because of their ability to identify preferred plant parts and plant components. So you said love some of those, maybe what would be considered maybe less desirable species for some folks. But yeah, if you want to know, what the nutritional value of those are, take some samples and send them to the lab and see what it comes back as. I know we used to, it was before my time, but we do a 2-week-long pasture land ecology program for NRCS agents across the country. And part of that is allowing those NRCS folks to set up grazing allocations. And we go out, we test their pastures beforehand. We give them a group of animals and a forage analysis from the pasture they're going to be using. And then they have to set up some grazing allocations for a couple weeks. And so it was before my time, but they used to use goats, and they'd actually have those goats browse in a more of a woodland type area. And so they actually would go in there and they'd clip off plant parts in that woodland area and get those tested, so they knew the nutrient value of that browse that those goats were likely to consume. And so you can get those tested just like anything else. And if you want to know what the nutrient content is.
Here's your last call for chat items. And I'm glad that you brought up crabgrass. We have, I've been thinking about improved crabgrass for some of my pastures that I want to revitalize. So thanks for bringing that information into the presentation. Karen did add something to the chat, if you'd like to go ahead and read that.
Yeah,
So
how
how
are you providing shade and supplements as you move paddock to paddock? I can move water, tubs, hoses, but can't find an affordable mobile shade. And bring a tractor to drag something heavy. Yeah, so shade is like one of it. I almost think that shade is maybe the most challenging component in a rotational grazing system. We can generally move water. We can dump out that water trough and we can move that pretty easily. But getting shade to them is it's a struggle. There are some options out there. And I know for a couple $1,000s, you can get a shade structure. We got some shades, they're pretty big shades, actually. They're like 10 by 20. They're pretty tall. They're 10 feet tall. We use them for sheep and cattle. And then we just welded runners on the bottom so we can drag them. So we just hook them up behind a four-wheeler, side by side, and we can just drag them paddock to paddock. So it's not like self-propelled or anything. But it's a structure that is relatively mobile, and we can drag that around behind the equipment that we have. We don't need a big tractor or anything to do it. And that works pretty well. I've also seen it's a little bit of manual labor, but if you just take a really kind of simple, low cost form of shade, just get a shade cloth from, Tractor Supply, whatever, local supply store you have. Get a shade cloth, and then take 4 T-posts. And if you just pound those T-posts in the ground, take wire on each corner of the shade cloth, stretch it between the T-posts, and in 10 or 15 minutes, you can have a shade structure put up anywhere on your farm. It's relatively low to the ground. You can't use it for cattle, but for just small ruminants, it can work really well. If it starts to droop in the middle, just put a T-post in the middle with a bucket on top so that you don't tear the tarp. Just flip a bucket upside down, put it on top of the T-post, and then hoist that up in the middle and kind of make a tent-like structure. And that can work really well. Again, it's a little bit of manual labor pounding T-posts in the ground, but it is a way that it's really flexible. You can move it anywhere, and it's relatively low cost. But that is a challenge, and I agree with you. And it's something that we struggle with too. So pasture plates, grazing sticks. So those grazing sticks are very useful. They give you kind of a really in a broad sense. Those drop plates do a better job, and you can do a little bit of math, and it gets complicated in a hurry and calculating yields. Those forage sticks do probably a better kind of, we talked about tailgate math, maybe like in the moment in the field type resource. Those grazing sticks are probably a better option to get a rough estimate of forage and canopy height, and then compare that and use that table on that grazing stick to calculate, how much forage dry matter is available per inch of forage, and get a yield estimate for a pasture. Then you can do what's called grazer's math and figure out, if I have 50 animals and I have 1,500 pounds of dry matter out here, how big of an area do I need to give them? So that grazing stick can be very useful. You also mentioned, do goats tear those portable shades down? I guess I've never tried the T-post shade structure with goats. They might. I don't know. You'd want to use pretty long T-posts and keep it up as high as you can above the ground. I know sheep, it works just fine. Goats can be destructive. Our really tall shade structures that we have on the runners, those are fine with the goats. We don't have any issues with those. What about moving? Supplement part of my question. Yeah, so supplement. So we use some 6-inch PVC pipes, and we just cut them in half. And so we take those PVCs, cut them in half. They make kind of a U shape, and we just set them on the ground. So they're not eating directly off the ground, but we can just throw them out there and supplement off of those if we need to provide some supplement. I've seen a number of different variations of that. Sometimes you can build kind of wood supports for it, but we don't. We just throw it on the ground and pour the feed into those cut in half PVC pipes, and that works pretty well. Rotational grazing, isn't that affecting reducing parasites? Yeah, so that's kind of it's a complicated topic. So in theory, it takes about 7 to 14 days for that parasite to go from the egg stage to the infective larvae stage. So in theory, where the whole idea with rotational grazing and parasite management comes in is, if we move them every 3 to 5 days or sooner, those animals are grazing the next paddock over by the time the infective larvae develop. Sounds great in theory, right? Well, the problem is the rest period, because those parasites take a very long time to die in the pasture. They can survive, especially during cooler times of the year, they can survive for a very long time, upwards of several months on your pasture. And so the rest period becomes the challenging part. And we generally recommend at least 45 days of rest to minimize parasite exposure, but that's not perfect. It might work well in really super hot middle of the summer type weather. 45 days might be sufficient. During just about any other time of the year, it's probably too short. And so it's a balancing act. If we wait forever and we have this extended rest period, then our forages are all going to be mature, and we're going to have a very poor quality nutritional source for our animals. So that doesn't work. And so it's a balance between forage and vegetation growth and maturity, and rest period to minimize parasite exposure. I actually think overgrazing probably has a bigger impact. We know that 90% of our infective larvae live within the first 4 inches of the forage. And so overgrazing is going to cause a lot of problems. If you graze closer than 4 inches, not only are you damaging that plant, but you are also exposing those animals to a lot more parasites. And so rotating them frequently, it can't hurt. Is it going to be perfect for parasite management? No. We want to make sure, ultimately, we want to make sure they have a high level of nutrition so they can fight off those parasites. But I think in moving them frequently, I think the bigger goal of that is making sure that we don't overgraze, we don't get too close to the ground, and that we avoid most of those parasites that live very close to the ground. That's a great question, and one that kind of a hot topic, something that we talk about and I get lots of questions about, and unfortunately I don't have a perfect answer for you. Tarps don't hold up in the wind and rain. 25 U's, 25. Yeah, so they are oh, what company? They're actually based out of Iowa. I can't think of it off the top of my head. I'll think of it. I'll look it up. We can get you a connection to that. They're based out of Iowa there. They're out of the same town that Field of Dreams is played. I'm blanking on the name of the company.
So they're out of Dyersville. I can do a quick, is it Farm Tech?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. I will do a quick search. I was able to put a link for the UW 4-H lab and the sheep production book, so I will see if I can find.
Perfect. Yeah, we got the Farm Tech. They're these big shade structures. You have to assemble them yourself, but it's not too terrible. And so that's what we use. There's certainly other options out there. And then it does not come with the runners. We had to weld the runners ourselves.
I hope this is the one that you were talking about. I'm not sure.
Yep, that's it.
Okay.
Yep,
Awesome.
that's
I've
it.
also seen some, and I don't know the company either, but they have a big pole in the middle and they kind of fan out. But I always think the wind might catch them. We get quite a bit of wind here in Iowa. So wind is definitely a destructor of tarps.
It
All
is.
right,
So,
well,
and we had, so before we put the runners on, we did have some problems. If the wind gets real high, they would tip over. The runners are heavy enough that they seem to be a pretty good anchor. And they hold up pretty well. Without the runners though, yeah, they do. We tried to use some like ratchet straps and kind of hold them down. It works okay, but really having those runners and that kind of anchor is kind of the best option we found.
awesome. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in. I want to let you get back to doing what you need to, because I know that's a little bit later for you out there on the East Coast. But thank you so much for joining us tonight. And at a later date, we'll have a recording of this up on YouTube. So thank you everyone for joining us.